Hi. In this lesson, we're going to be working with how to solve absolute values. Now, before we get started, we first have to ask ourselves, what are absolute values and what are they used for in real life? Well, remember back in the day, absolute values always had the notation of having this symbol right here. And you could put a number, for example, absolute value 7, or you could even put the absolute value of -7. But what does this absolute value actually represent? An absolute value is the distance from one point to another point, but not just the distance, it's the positive distance. Normally, when you first learned absolute values, it was a distance from zero. So, for example, if I were to graph -7 and 7 on the number line, ask yourself this one question. How far is -7 from zero and how far is 7? Hopefully, you agree it would be 7 units. And if you were to count from 0 to -7, it would also be not -7 units because that's a strange way of writing it. You would put simply +7, right? So, because of that, the absolute value represents a positive distance from one point to another point. Sounds good? Okay. Now, we're going to do these first two examples. But remember what we said, an absolute value is always a positive distance, right? That's the reason why every single time there's a negative inside of an absolute value, what is it going to always become? It's always going to become positive. So, for example, in the first one, the absolute value of -6 is simply going to be what? +6. And the absolute value of +6 is going to be what? 6. Why is that? Because it's 6 units away from what? Normally 0. But it doesn't always have to be from 0. It could be from wherever position it's at. And you'll see more examples later down the road. Okay? So absolute value has a notation of 2 bars outside the number, and it's always going to turn a negative number to a positive number. Now, there's a couple rules that we need to understand before we actually solve for absolute values. You're going to realize that in this section, it's going to get a little bit more complicated than what we're used to. So because of that, you have to remember that the first step is always isolate the absolute value. That's step 1. Step 2 is ask yourself, what is the absolute value equal to? So once you get it by itself, what is the absolute value equal to? Is it equal to a positive number? Is it equal to a negative number? Or is it equal to 0? If it's equal to a positive number, that means you're going to get two possible solutions. Two possible solutions. If it's equal to a negative number, you're going to get 0 solutions, or also known as no solution. If it's equal to 0, then it's equal to 1 solution, meaning you're going to get 1 answer. Okay? Those are 3 different types of scenarios that you can end up having working with an absolute value. What's step 1 again? Isolate it. Then after step 2 is working with what is the absolute value equal to. Okay? Now, if you get 2 possible solutions, I want you to remember you have to set up 2 different equations. If it's equal to a negative number, then you're going to have no solution, so you don't have to worry about any equations. And for anyone that forgot, that notation means no solution. And if it's equal to 0, then that means you're going to have 1 equation. Now, after you set up your equations, you're going to move on to step 3, and you're going to solve. How many equations are you going to solve? It depends on the scenario. What's the absolute value equal to? Okay, these are your steps. I would recommend you writing them down, taking notes of them, understanding them, because this is what most students struggle with. Understanding that they have to isolate the absolute value, get it by itself, and then ask yourself, how many equations should I solve for? Are you all ready? Let's begin. First scenario, example A. Absolute value of x is equal to 8. What's step 1? Isolate the absolute value. It is. So because the absolute value is already isolated, you just have to ask yourself, what is the absolute value equal to? In this case, it's equal to a positive 8. What does that mean that it's equal to a positive number? How many solutions am I going to have? I'm going to have how many? I'm going to have 2 solutions. What are my solutions? My 2 solutions are going to be always to set this inside of the absolute value. Always the inside. Always the inside. You're going to set the inside equal to positive 8, but you're also going to set it equal to -8. Why am I setting equal to positive, negative? Remember, if I were to plug 8 and -8 back into the absolute value, what does the absolute value eliminate? It eliminates the negative. That's why it can also be a negative answer. Now, because these absolute values are technically gone, I just have to now solve for x. And luckily, both x's are already solved for. So x is equal to 8 and -8. And those are my 2 answers. Okay, and you can check because if you were to plug this in, the absolute value of both of those answers are going to still be positive 8. Scenario B. Absolute value of x is equal to 0. Absolute value is already done, so step 1 is check marked. So the absolute value is equal to 0. What does that mean? If it's equal to 0, how many solutions am I going to get? I'm going to get 1 solution. So what am I going to do? I'm going to set the inside equal to 0. X is equal to 0. Why is it only one solution? I couldn't set equal to -0. That wouldn't make sense. So that's why x is equal to 0. And that's my final answer. Now C, absolute value of x is equal to -8. What does that mean? Absolute value is equal to negative number. So if it's equal to a negative number, what are you going to end up having? No solution, meaning that you can't have an answer. And that's it. But what is step one? You have to get it by itself. After you do step one, you isolate the absolute value, then you could ask yourself the scenarios that you have. Okay? All right, let's move on to a lot more complicated problems, like example 3. Example 3 says the absolute value of x minus 6 plus 4 is equal to 8. So ask yourself, what's step one? Step one is to isolate the absolute value. What does that mean? I want to isolate everything inside of it. So what am I going to do first? I'm going to first subtract 4 to both sides. Remember, everything that we learned in a previous lesson, whatever you do to one side, do to the other. I'm going to go ahead and combine like terms. The 4 and the negative 4 are going to cancel. The absolute value of x minus 6 is going to drop down. I'm going to keep in the absolute value. And 8 minus 4 is equal to 4. Once you get the absolute value by itself, you have to ask yourself, how many different type of solutions am I going to get? Absolute value is equal to a positive 4. How many solutions am I going to get? I should get 2. So because I'm going to get 2 solutions, I have to set up 2 different scenarios with the inside of the absolute value. So I'm going to set x minus 6 equal to a positive 4, but I'm also going to set x minus 6 equal to negative 4. Once again, why? Because the inside of the absolute value can equal to 4 or negative 4. So we're going to solve for both of them. I'm going to solve it like normal now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add 6 to both sides. And if I add 6 to both sides, I'm going to get x is equal to 4 plus 6, which is 10. That's my first solution. Then I'm going to add 6 on my second equation. And now on the right-hand side, you're going to notice I have x is equal to negative 4 plus 6. Once again, don't forget from a previous lesson, negative plus a positive. Remember, one negative you always subtract. One negative you always subtract. So 6 minus 4 is going to be 2. 6 is bigger, so it's going to be positive 2. What does that mean? That means that my final answer is going to be 10 as well as positive 2. And that's it. Is it more work? Absolutely. Why? Because you're solving more equations than you had in the beginning of the problem. And this is why most students will struggle with this. And that's why it's very important to understand the steps. Step 1, isolate. After you isolate, ask yourself how many equations you're going to have. Based on that, that's going to be the equations you're going to have to solve for. In this case, it was 2 because it was equal to a positive 4. Okay? All right. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. I'm going to recommend once you guys get used to it, once you get used to this problem, try to solve it on your own. Pause the video and then solve it and then press play to see if you get your answer correct. So for this problem, absolute value in the problem, so I have to isolate it. What does that mean? I have to move the negative 9. How do I move it? I do the opposite, which is plus 9. I'm going to do it at both sides of the equal sign. Then I'm going to solve. The absolute value is going to come down, so it's going to be the absolute value of x plus 4. The negative 9 plus 9s are going to cancel out, and 1 plus 9 is going to equal to 10. Once I have this, my absolute value is solved for. It's isolated. So I'm going to set the inside of this equal to positive 10, but I'm also going to set it equal to negative 10. Now, once I do this, I did this because it was equal to a positive number. Remember, a positive number means you're going to have 2 different solutions. That's why I set up 2 different solutions. I'm going to subtract 4 to both of them. Why? Because plus 4 opposite is negative 4. So I'm going to minus 4 to both sides. On the left side, it's going to cancel. And on the right side, 10 minus 4 is going to be 6. That's my first solution. On the second equation, I'm going to subtract 4. Same step that I did on the first one. But you'll notice on the right side, I have x equals negative 10 minus 4. What do we do when there's 2 negatives? 2 negatives, you always add. You always add when there's 2 negatives. So 10 plus 4 is 14. But because they're both negative, it stays negative. So what are my 2 answers? My 2 answers are going to be 6 and negative 14. Why do I have 2 answers? Because I had 2 equations because the absolute value was equal to a positive number. If you got this right, great job. Okay? It's all about the steps. So we're going to go ahead and move on to example 5. Example 5, there's a lot more steps in this problem. Why? Because there's a number in front of the absolute value, which is okay. I'm going to do the same thing. Isolate it. How do I isolate it? I have to subtract 1 to both sides. The ones on the left side are going to cancel out nicely. I'm left with 2. Absolute value x minus 1 is equal to 1 minus 1, which we all know is going to be 0. I wish I could set it equal to anything, but right now I have to first isolate the absolute value. So I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite of what's in front of the 2. Technically, they're together because it's 2 times the absolute value. So what's the opposite? What's the inverse of multiplication? It's division. So I'm going to go ahead and divide by 2 to both sides. I'm going to be left with absolute value of x minus 1 is equal to 0 divided by 2, which is always 0. Remember, any number under 0 will always be 0. 0 over any number will always be 0. Now, once the absolute value is equal to 0, I have to ask myself, what does this mean? Go back to your rules. Absolute value equal to 0 means I have how many solutions? I have 1. So what am I going to do? I'm going to set the inside equal to 0. And that's going to be adding 1 to both sides, all about the inverses. Negative 1 plus 1 cancel out nicely. 0 plus 1 is 1. So that means that my final answer is x equals 1. And that's it. One solution because the absolute value was equal to 0. Okay? All right. We have a few left. We're going to go ahead and move on to example 6. Example 6 says this. 2 absolute value x plus 2 plus 3 equals 1. Once again, try solving this on your own. Pause the video, play it, see if you get it right. So in this problem, our first step is we have to isolate the absolute value. So what I'm going to do to both sides, I'm going to subtract 3. Why? Because the opposite of positive 3 is subtracting 3. So all of the left side is going to come down. So 2 absolute value x plus 2. The 3 minus 3 cancel out nicely. 1 minus 3, don't forget. 1 minus 9 you subtract. Bigger minus small. 3 minus 1 is 2. 3 is bigger, so it's going to become negative 2. Next step, what's the opposite of multiplying by 2? I'm going to go ahead and divide by 2. And then I'm going to have absolute value of x plus 2 on the inside, because the 2's cancel out nicely, is equal to negative 2 divided by 2. Don't worry about the negative. 2 divided by 2 is 1. When you divide or multiply by 1 negative, it always just becomes a negative. Now I have this solution. Absolute value of x plus 2 is equal to negative 1. It's isolated. So what happens when an absolute value is equal to a negative number? It means what? It means that your answer is going to be no solution. What does that mean? It means that you can't solve it. That's my final answer. No solution. Why is this one so tricky? Because everyone tries to solve for it. They keep going. But once it's equal to a negative number, it means you can't go anymore. Okay? All right. So we're going to do our last 2 examples. Actually, this is our last example, example 7. Now, example 7 is one of the tougher questions because it deals with setting up an absolute value. And the reason why in the beginning of the lesson I said you have to worry about what the distance is from one point to another point, you're going to notice it right here. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. It says, in a 9th grade history class, Ms. Hernandez mentions to the class that all the students in the class scored an average of an 80% on their last exam. I'm going to underline that because anytime that you read words and numbers, probably represents something. So 80% represents the average of the last exam. The teacher then mentions that everyone scored 15 from the average. So everyone scored 15 from the average. What does that mean? That means that technically I can score above 80% and below it by how much? By 15. It says write an absolute value equation to determine what possible scores the class scored in. So you have to first ask yourself, what does this mean? Here's your hint. We know something's going to go into the absolute value, and we know there's going to be equal to a number. We know that. This number right here on the outside is going to be the number that you have to plus and minus. Why? Think about it. When an absolute value is equal to a positive number, don't we make that number positive and negative? So think about it. We have 2 numbers we're working with, 80 and 15%. Which number did we go up and down from? What are we adding and subtracting from? Hopefully you thought 15, which is right. 15 is what we're adding and what we're subtracting from, because that's how much the range was. So we're going to put 15 on the right-hand side. Where does 80 go? 80 is going to go right here to be x minus 80 equals to 15. And that's my setup. You're going to notice that the inside is going to always be the opposite number of what you're working with. Right now, I know that the class scored an 80%. That's the class average. So that's why 80 goes in the middle. But on the outside is going to be what you're plus or minusing. Now, in this situation, all they wanted to do was write it. But I'm going to go ahead and solve it to show you what this actually means. If I were to solve this, I have an absolute value equal to a positive number, which is 15. So what do? I set x minus 80 equal to positive 15, but I also set x minus 80 equal to negative 15. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add 80 to both sides. And when I add 80 to both sides, look what happens. 80's cancel out nicely. I'm left with x equals 90. And then plus 80 plus 80. X equals to how much? Negative 15 plus 80. One negative, what do? You subtract. 80 minus 15, 75. 80 is bigger, so it's going to be positive 75. What does this mean? That means my two scores are 75 and 90. What does that represent? My two values, my two solutions? It means that everyone scored between 75 to 90. 75 to 90. And 80 is right in the middle, which is the average. And that's how you do it. So when you see a word problem like this, which are always going to be obviously the trickiest problems you're ever going to have, outside number is how much you go up and down from. Inside number is what you're starting from, but always opposite. Okay? So on the last slide, all we're going to do is go over the rules again. Remember, the first rule when solving for absolute values is isolate the absolute value. Because once you isolate the absolute value, step 2 is to ask yourself, how many solutions and equations am I going to have? If it's equal to a positive number, 2 solutions, 2 equations. If it's equal to a negative number, no solution. If it's equal to 0, what does it mean? If it's equal to 0, it means that I'm going to have one solution. Now, once you work on all those steps, step 3, what is step 3 again? Solve for x. And based on the number of solutions you're going to have, should be the answer that you get. And that's it. This is always a complicated lesson, so you want to make sure you practice this and understand this for the future, because these are easier steps that we may forget. Okay? All right. I appreciate you for watching. Hopefully this helped, and I'll see you next time.